Hello, everyone. Prof D in the place to be, which is with all of you. I hope that you're all well and look forward to talking about value chains today. So, trail of ahead, we've got value chain, talking about how to do value chain analysis. There's this section called outsourcing in the arrow. It'll make sense when you see it. And we're going to connect this to something we've talked about before, which is differentiation and cost leadership, some general sort of basic business level strategies, and then what it means to change activities in the value chain, why that may be difficult. But first, as always, we're going back in time. We're always going to come back to this, right? The idea is, how do you go about gaining competitive advantage, right? And the levers that you have to manipulate how much value is created is willingness to pay and cost to produce. And we talked in the previous lecture about how if you're primarily trying to deal with the C of that, you're in a certain area, which is cost leadership. All right, but if you're primarily trying to increase willingness to pay, then you're in the differentiation portion of this diagram, right? And we talked about how within that you can have different approaches to the market. You can either be a broad cost leadership focused or broad differentiated company, or you can be a focused or niche cost leadership company or a focused differentiation company. Okay, so we talked about a couple of examples. One of those is Walmart. Walmart's very broad cost leadership oriented in terms of its general strategy, right? It's really organized around trying to bring costs down, and such by extension, it can bring down the price that it charges people. That's how Walmart has its advantage as compared to something like Tesla, which started out very much as a focused differentiated player, right? They're trying to do things like having great service and wonderful product features that will increase people's willingness to pay for things high and way above other cars so they can charge a premium price. And that allowed them to gain a foothold in the market such that they could eventually build cheaper cars like sedans, right? But they needed to be in a position where they could establish economies of scale. And they did that by making a electric sports car that they knew the willingness to pay would be high for. And then also in that, we talked about how this intersects with the various Porter's aspects of Porter's five forces, in that if you're pursuing one of these strategies, it can allow you to basically blunt some of the effects of Porter's five forces, right? So in the case of Walmart and its low-cost broad strategy, it's low cost, right? It basically is a barrier to entry. No one's going to want to come in and try to tackle Walmart because Walmart has this sort of low cost position based on economies of scale. It would take a new entrant a very long time to get in and do that, all right? If buyer power were to somehow increase in that space more than it is, Walmart could deal with that because its cost structure is already very low, right? So it can bring down prices, right? So these are ways in which the strategies themselves can help blunt industry effects, all right? But we have to actually go a little bit further back in time to get properly situated for all the material this week, right? The generic business level strategies will come into play, but also we have to talk about this, right? We spent some time talking about VRIO, right? And trying to understand how there can be, the basis for understanding whether or not a resource or capability can be the source of a competitive advantage, right? But the thing we haven't talked about is identifying those capabilities, right? And that's where value chain comes in. That's what we're going to be talking about in this lecture, okay? And just remember, going back to VRIO, right? The idea is that if you have 4 yeses, if something's valuable, rare, costly to imitate, and exploited by the organization, then that can be a source of sustainable competitive advantage, right? Till now, I've asked you to sort of just generally understand what organized to exploit might be, all right? Another way you can look at the value chain is that it's a way to organize your activities and capabilities in such a way that your organization can exploit them, right? It's even possible that each activity capability on its own isn't unique, but taken in sum, right, the total configuration of all those capabilities can be a source of competitive advantage, right? But in terms of organized to exploit, you might remember the case of Xerox, right? Xerox as a company its whole value chain was set up around creating copiers to sell to large corporate clients, right? It's a very established, profitable, clear business, and their whole value chain was set up around that. Okay, so even though they had all these people at Xerox PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center, coming up with this novel stuff, right? Like a graphical user interface, like the mouse, like personal computers, like Ethernet, all that stuff. Nothing about them was set up to actually take advantage of those things because they weren't selling those kinds of things to consumers, right? Whereas Steve Jobs comes into Xerox, he sees all this stuff, and he sees how it can be useful for the way that his Apple's value chain is set up to sell things directly to consumers, to sell computing products to consumers. That's why Apple was able to take advantage of that technology in a way that Xerox never could, because of how its value chain is set up. Okay, so, but let's, again, I've until now I've asked you to just generally imagine if a company could be set up to exploit its resources, right? So now it's a question of what that actually looks like, right? So the idea is that, firms are a collection of activities to produce, market, and support and deliver its products, right? They have activities set up to make stuff, right? That's part of the value chain. Right? And then they have capabilities and configurations of capabilities that allow them to do that particular thing well, right? And those capabilities and their configuration can be a source of competitive advantage, right? No one thing that Walmart does is that unique, okay? Lots of firms that are big can do things to try to, bully their suppliers. Lots of firms can have very sophisticated supply chain management systems so there's know where things are coming from. Lots of firms can do things like cross-dock trucks, right? So basically what Walmart does is that it cross-docks trucks. So one truck comes in with goods that need to go out to a store. Instead of taking those goods into the warehouse, those goods come off one truck onto another truck and then immediately head out to the store. Doing things efficiently like that cut down the costs. All right, but none of that in of itself is unique, but it's the fact that Walmart does all of these things together so well that it can be a source of sustainable competitive advantage. Right? Now, in addition, the way the activities are connected within a firm, the linkages, and even between firms, those linkages can be, real, valuable, rare, and imitable, right? And can be a source of competitive advantage. And that's the idea. A key part of the value chain is being organized in terms of activities to exploit the resources that you have. Okay? It doesn't matter if you just have a resource that can be a source of competitive advantage. You have to be organized to use it. And it's got to be enmeshed within a value chain. So we're going to try to understand what a value chain is. And this all gets back to the basic idea that firms need to add value. If you want to make a profit, you need to add value as a firm. Okay? And the idea we talked about before in the Gimmelwatt and Rivkin reading is that added value is basically everything of value that we lose if a firm vanishes. I'm going to have to correct that slide. That's not quite right. But the idea is that if a firm exists, it creates value, right? The added value would be what's lost if that firm were to go away, right? And value is added if the whole sort of ecosystem, the network, suppliers, customers, and complements is more productive with the firm than without it. That's how you know it's adding value, okay? Now, I think that this has seemed to be somewhat of an abstract concept, this thing of added value, right? So I've put together, I think, a clear example to help us work through this idea of what adding value really means, okay? So this is going to make it concrete. It's a simple value. I'm guessing that many, if not all of you, have been to Starbucks. In principle, raw materials come into one end of Starbucks. Coffee beans, sugar, eggs, flour, blueberries, paper cups, and milk come into one end of Starbucks. Now, there are an assortment of activities that are organized underneath that logo, right? This represents inside of Starbucks. There's some stuff happening under this and all the stuff, the raw materials go into the box, all right? And then products come out of the box. Now at the other end comes a vanilla latte and a cup and a blueberry muffin, right? Now, I'm sure some of you are saying at this point, okay, thanks, Prof D. You've really made my day with this really simple picture of Starbucks, okay? I know how making coffee and baking works. And now I'm hungry, thanks. Are you going to DoorDash me a coffee and a muffin? All right, so once you get past being hungry, just stick with me for a second. All right, so you should know that it costs maybe 80 cents all in to make a flavored latte in terms of ingredients, okay? Even less to do it if you're, in terms of ingredients, if you're doing it at scale like Starbucks does. Starbucks is such a big organization that it orders massive quantities of beans and sugar and all that stuff, so it can do it for even cheaper than 80 cents a cup. All right, muffins are even cheaper. Okay, if you, a random person, bought a box of muffin mix, okay, we're talking like 30 cents a muffin. All right, and if you make them from scratch, like you buy all the separate ingredients, it's even less per muffin. Now, some of you watching this have easily paid $2 for that vanilla latte and $3 for that muffin. Okay, that means that Starbucks is adding value. Those activities that are happening under the hood have created something for which your willingness to pay for it is over and above the cost to make it. It is a it is a simple example, but that's what adding value means. Okay, and this is, to my mind, a very tangible way that the concept of adding value has touched your lives. People take some kind of raw ingredients and they make it into something you want to consume that you're willing to pay much more for than the cost of the ingredients to make it. All right. So the question becomes just what is happening under the hood? What are the activities and how are they organized such that they are adding value to those inputs such that they result in something that you want to pay money for? All right. Here is one representation of that. Okay. There are some primary activities that I'm going to talk about. There's some support activities that I'm going to talk about. Most organizations, especially ones at scale, have some of these things happening, right? And the bottom line is that they figure out how to get all of these raw materials and do various things to them such that they add value in a way that people want to pay for it. Okay. And this concept is called Porter's value chain. Okay. So as I mentioned, there are basically, in Porter's value chain, there are two kinds of activities: primary activities and support activities, right? Inbound logistics are the things associated with receiving, storing, and disseminating the inputs. Okay, so this is trying to figure out, how are you going to get the coffee beans to where they need to go, right? Then you have operations, and those are all the activities associated with transforming inputs into the final product. Okay, right? So you can almost think of operations as being the stores, right? The stores are, transforming the coffee and the beans and the milk into lattes. Okay, and then the outbound logistics, the activities involved in collecting, storing, and distributing the goods to buyers. Now, some of that can be like actually giving the coffee, but other it can be just sort of figuring out how, like if Starbucks makes certain goods in-house, it's trying to figure out how to get them out to the store for them to be sold, right? Okay. You've got marketing and sales, and those are the activities associated with providing a means by which buyers can purchase the product and being convinced to do so. Okay, so those are your sales reps, and figuring out your marketing. What kind of ads are you going to run in order to get people to buy these things? Okay, and then there's service, right? And that's providing services to enhance the value of the product, right? And this can be aftercare, installation, repair parts, adjustments, right? In a place like Starbucks, like they have customer service to handle if you've had any complaints. Sometimes they send you surveys after the fact, right, to understand how your how your experience was at Starbucks, that's aftercare. That goes under service. Those are the primary activities. The things that are primarily involved in getting raw materials to the end customer and convincing them to buy it and make sure their experience has been good. Okay. Then you've got the support activities. All right. These help the other things to work. Okay. So you've got firm infrastructure. Okay. Infrastructure here does not mean buildings. It means organizational structure and design. And the departments like you've heard of. So finance, accounting, legal, government affairs, general management. Right. That's what firm infrastructure means. Then you've got human resource management. That's just making sure you have the right people with the right skills, and then training, developing, and compensating them such they can do all the other stuff within the organization. All right. Then you've got procurement, and procurement is just everything that you need to purchase for the firm to operate, and all inputs that go into the value chain. Okay. Sometimes the line often gets blurred between procurement and inbound logistics, but procurement involves getting all the stuff all over the organization that the organization needs to run. And technology development is the creation of stuff that improves the product and service. Okay. R&D is in here, research and development, but it's also, things that help these other parts of the organization run more effectively or run more smoothly. Okay. Now, this is a value chain, both because within the organization, if all of these components are well connected to each other, they can more sufficiently connect. How do I put this? If they're all well linked within the firm, those connections can be a source of competitive advantage. All right. But also keep in mind that in many cases, the end of one company's value chain is the start of another company's value chain. Okay? So if a company or firm can connect more efficiently with the firms on either side of its chain better than its competitors can, then that can also help form a competitive advantage. All of these things together form the set of capabilities that a company has. Now, the question is where did this come from? All right. The value chain is from Porter, okay? And it's a recognition that it may be possible for managers to isolate potential resources that can be used in gaining an advantage for their respective organizations, okay? Another way of thinking about this is that it's Michael Porter crying uncle a little bit, right? Because Porter's Five Forces comes out, right? And it basically is an understanding of how you understand how profitable an industry will be based on certain characteristics. Right? But then the resource-based view comes out and it also says that, well, in addition to that, a lot of the determinants of company profitability are not based on industry factors, right? So how do you explain that, Porter? Well, this is basically Porter's response. Like, well, here's how firms can be organized in such a way that there can be this difference in profitability among firms. Now, something I want to point out here is that even though Porter is kind of crying uncle here, right, and actually one of the key scholars of the resource-based view, the VRIO, basically said, yeah, Porter had to do this. He had to respond to the fact that internal analysis was telling us more about strategy than Porter's Five Forces could, right? But the other thing to know is that the resource-based view of VRIO is not perfect, right? So for example, Porter's Five Forces tells you specifically the kinds of conditions under which you will make more or less money, right? It's really good for that. It basically says that if you've got, there's low buyer power, low supplier power, it's very difficult to enter the industry and there aren't any substitutes, you'll probably make a lot of money, okay? VRIO, or the resource-based view, doesn't specify the conditions under which you should expect to make money. It just tells you how you may be able to get together resources that will help you have a competitive advantage. Okay. Now, the one thing that both resource-based view / VRIO and this value chain perspective suggests is that resources are really useful in the presence of other resources and capabilities. Okay, so how do you go about explaining that interconnectedness? And that's what the value chain is really good at. Now, you've all been in school for a bit, so you've probably also heard about supply chain. Okay, these two concepts are connected, but they have slightly different origins and they focus on different things. So the value chain is really talking about all of the activities that creates or adds value for the end consumer. Okay, and it comes out of strategic management as a field, and it's really more about trying to understand a basis for competitive advantage. Right? If you've got a very, very tight value chain, then that can be a source of competitive advantage. Supply chain, more focused on the activities from inbound raw materials to the product being in customer possession, right? Just basically, how do you get raw materials to a finished product for the customer, right? It comes out of the operations management field, which has different things that it focuses on. It's more about timing, quality, and coordination, right? How to figure out the logistics of getting raw materials to the places they need to be in the most efficient way possible, and coordinating the activities to produce the product, right? They're definitely related, okay? If you've got a value chain, there's probably a supply chain underlying it somewhere, all right? But they have slightly different focuses. Value chain is about figuring out the specific way to connect all of the activities in the firm to gain a competitive advantage, okay? So, as I said before, this is what it looks like, all right? Now, the thing you should note about this picture is that it's very neat. And if any of you ever worked for a company or organization, you know that they are not neat. Okay? You should think of organizations as looking more like this. Firms are not nice and neat. Firms look like there's groups everywhere. They're doing different things, and sometimes these groups talk to one another. This is more how you should imagine a firm. All right? They have these pieces of work that need to get done in order to add value. But sometimes these pieces do not all work together or communicate as well as they should. So what a goal is of management is to figure out ways to create connections between all of these pieces better, right? Okay, so firm infrastructure is important and firm infrastructure and procurement are important for figuring out coordinating between all the departments to make sure that all the materials get to the right place in a timely fashion for the inbound logistics team to then get them to operations. Human resources management needs to connect with marketing and sales. If you have a very high-end product, you need very competent people in order to sell that. If you are in a business of selling a differentiated product, customer service is a really big deal. Right? So you need human resources management to give you the right kinds of people, right? The technology department is useful all over the place in terms of getting better procedures, better equipment for managing the operations and the outbound logistics process. To the extent that all of these pieces work together more effectively, it can be a source of sustainable competitive advantage, right? That's why this is important. Now, as I said before, one way it can be a source of competitive advantage is that you want all the pieces to talk to each other or to be tightly connected within the firm, right? The other way this can matter is between firms, okay? As I said before, what the end of one firm's value chain is the beginning of another, right? So you shouldn't necessarily think about it as just being one of these diagrams. There are several of them together, okay? Starbucks doesn't necessarily grow its coffee beans. It buys them from somebody else, right? So behind Starbucks, if this would be Starbucks, behind them is another firm that is, planting, growing, and shipping out coffee beans to other people, right? Okay. You could also think about a company like DoorDash, right? DoorDash is here. Starbucks is here, right? DoorDash can send It takes the output from Starbucks, which is coffee, and then it does things and it brings it to you, right? That's another part of the overall value chain that you might be exposed to. Okay. Now, what firms might want to do, okay, is they might want to integrate along the value chain. Okay. So instead of just being here, they spread out a little bit and try to eat up some of the value chain behind them or in front of them. Okay. Now, if you eat up the value chain behind you, right, you're trying to control where the input comes from. That is called backwards vertical integration. Okay. I know technically this chart is horizontal, okay, but it's called vertical integration. So whenever you hear vertical, you should think value chain. And if you're doing backwards vertical integration, you're trying to control where the input is coming from. In the case of something like Starbucks, that would be like Starbucks owning and operating its own coffee plantations, right? Or their own farms where they produce milk and grow wheat for flour. That would be backwards vertical integration, controlling where stuff comes from. Or you could do it the other way. Okay? Controlling where the output goes. That's forward vertical integration. Right? So if Starbucks acquired a delivery company, right? So, because something could be happening, right? There could be a pandemic, for example, and people aren't coming into Starbucks, but they still need to get their product the last mile to the customer. All right? There's another company that has a whole value chain that does that. Well, Starbucks could try to acquire that company and eat up that part of the value chain. That would be forward vertical integration. Okay? You've seen this for other things too. Some of you, I am certain, are watching this lecture on a Dell laptop. All right? Well, behind Dell in the value chain is Intel. Intel making CPUs that go inside of Dell laptops, right? So some of the stuff that Intel makes then goes into Dell, right? It's in a different part of the value chain, all right? Now, Dell sells some of its computers directly, but it also Best Buy sells Dell laptops too, right? Best Buy is forward. It's on the value chain, okay? So if Dell were to integrate backwards, it'd be acquiring a chip maker, okay? Or if it were integrating forward, it'd be acquiring Best Buy, okay? Then you have a company like Apple. I know some of you are watching this lecture on MacBooks, okay? The thing that's different about Apple is that both in front of and behind Apple on the sort of we'll call it the MacBook part of the value chain is Apple, because Apple makes its own silicon, it makes its own CPUs, okay? And it also has its own stores, right? So Apple both backward integrated and forward integrated along the industry value chain. And there can be some strong benefits to that because if, as I said before, one part of the competitive advantage can be trying to tighten up the connections between what's ahead of you on the value chain and what's behind you on the value chain. Right? You can try to have those closer connections with the companies you work with. Or you can do what Apple did, is just expand up and down the value chain. Right? You can be very tight with the other parts of the value chain if those are inside of your company. So what do we do now? Right? Well, we want to try to understand how we go about analyzing the activity within a value chain. Okay, and then how it can be a source of competitive advantage. All right, because we generally understand how you gain and sustain a competitive advantage, right? It's this. How can you widen the wedge between cost and willingness to pay? Okay, if you can make that larger, you're creating more value, and if that gives you room to move around the price such that you can capture some of that value, right? So we know this part already. Right? The question is how we go from thinking about the activities that a firm's doing and then how those can be connected to costs and willingness to pay. Because then that will help us understand how to create a competitive advantage. Again, there are activities in the value chain. Those activities can either affect costs or they can affect willingness to pay. Your goal as a company is to make cost and willingness to pay as far apart as possible, because that gives you more space to create and sustain a competitive advantage. So you start with costs, the cost of activities and the cost drivers, right? The things that make the costs of activities rise and fall. Okay. Now this is important because you want to know what's moving your business, all right? But you also want to know it because you can make some estimates about what costs your competitors are incurring as well. So in the example of the reading, there's a bakery, right? And they were trying to understand their competitor's position. Well, you can look at stuff that's visible in the market, right? So where are your competitors selling? So the bakery is looking at where are their competitors selling? How big is their market share? How big is their product line? Those things are all observable. Okay. Then they're able to look at their own cost structure as an estimate of their competitor's cost position. And that gets an idea of what the customer looks like, right? Because with most things in strategy, this is a relative analysis. You want to be doing better than your competitors. Right? So some things that you want to think about, and this is not an exhaustive list. You want to think about your production costs, how much it actually costs you to make things. Think about your cost of sales. It's also called costs of goods sold. How much are you spending on R&D and the service portions of your value chain? How efficient are your facilities to make stuff, right? That has an effect on your cost structure. Are there outsiders that are providing activities, right? Maybe you have outsourced a portion of something in your organization, right? Some people outsource the human resources function. They don't actually manage the payroll and all that stuff inside the organization. They've outsourced it. So how much are those costs? Okay. And can you simplify any of your production processes? Because if you can make something simpler, it can often be cheaper. Right. So those are the things in terms of costs. Now, what we know from research, or at least what the research suggests, is that willingness to pay accounts for more of the differences in observed profitability among direct competitors. Okay, so these questions are really trying to help you figure out who the customers are, who would you want the customers to be, and then what you can decide to do to deliver what the customers want. All right, lots of things can directly or indirectly affect willingness to pay. So on the example of Starbucks, they're going to pay more for fair trade coffee, that might affect people's willingness to pay, knowing that Starbucks is working with more socially responsible workers, socially responsible companies, right? That can be beneficial to them. Knowing that the suppliers or knowing that their employees are getting paid a living wage. Right? Or knowing that Starbucks has benefits to try to help educate their employees if their employees want to take advantage of it. Those things can increase people's willingness to pay for it. Knowing that the workers at Patagonia, are well compensated and do good things in the community. If there's a service aspect to working at Patagonia, those things might make people want to buy Patagonia more. Okay? Now, some things to think about if you're trying to analyze willingness to pay. All right? Worker compensation for productivity. All right? If you're at the kind of place, think about this for a second. Have any of you ever shopped at a high-end boutique, right? Where they're selling products where the people are paying a lot for them, the willingness to pay is kind of high, right? Well, you want to then compensate workers in a very particular way, commission, in order to make them incented to actually to really sell those products. They have a stake in making those products sold. You want to make your products really attractive. You want to keep customers around. You want to have activities in your value chain, probably in the service part, that helps keep customers so they keep coming back to you. Customer acquisition can be expensive, right? And if you keep a customer loyal to you, you can probably enhance their willingness to pay over time. Okay? Customer credit. Right? If people feel they have access to more financing, they might buy more stuff. Okay? You want to train employees. You want to make sure that when the raw materials come in, they are handled really well, because quality matters when you're trying to deliver high willingness to pay. And you want to have good relationships with your suppliers, because that's going to matter in terms of making sure that goods come in time and of high quality. All right, so these are some things, again, not exhaustive, but these kinds of activities need to be in the value chain if what you're focusing on is willingness to pay. Okay. Overall, what you're trying to then do is you want to move those things as far apart as possible, right? So what are the things that you're going to want to do? Okay. Well, you want to look at the connections between parts of the value chain. All right. Anytime that there are frictions between sections of the value chain, like where departments don't talk to each other as well as they should, right? Or goods don't flow as effectively from one part of the value chain to the other. That costs money. They bump up against each other. Those frictions cost money. Anytime there's a delay, that costs money. Okay? So if you fix those, you can bring down your costs, right? And if you make other parts of the chain, like reinforce them, you get them to, in addition to have them, if they're already talking well, if you do things to reinforce those connections, okay, that can both save money and add value. All right. Then you want to manage the edges, right, of the value chain. You want to make it easier for suppliers to get the raw inputs into your company's value chain. And then you want to make it easier for the customers to get the products. So you're actually managing the friction at the edges. Remember what I said before? The way this works is that you want to make sure the connections in the value chain are good, but also the connections between the edges of the value chain and everybody else. You want to make those good. Okay. The next thing you might want to do is think about scale, right? You can scale up to maybe sell more products, right? See if there's a way you can take advantage of scale economies. Those are ways that you can also potentially increase the wedge. More products, if your value chain will support it, could be the case for, willingness to pay will increase, right? Apple did this, right? Initially, when Steve Jobs first came back to Apple, it was really just selling computers, right? So what did they do? They eventually made more products, including the iPod and then the iPhone. They made more products. Okay? Or you can try to take advantage of scale economies. Get to be big enough such that your average cost for each unit goes down. That will also increase the wedge. And then look for opportunities to do things cheaper, which maybe is to outsource. Okay? That's when you, quite simply, purchase a value-creating activity from somebody else. Right? Few organizations possess all the resources and capabilities required to achieve competitive superiority in all primary and support activities. It's very difficult to be good at everything. Okay? So focus on the stuff that you're good at. Focus on the things that the firm does well. Right? And over time, you can take advantage of the fact that some outside suppliers have gotten really good at doing other things. Right? There are some human resources firms that are really good at managing payroll and benefits. Right? So it may be worth it to outsource some of that activity to another firm. And that's what it allows, right? You can focus on what you're good at, and you can take advantage of the fact that some outsourcing firms are very good. I used to work for a company called FactSet Research Systems. One of the things that I did in product development was I helped to produce transcripts of conference calls. Right? If you're a company, whenever you report your corporate earnings, you have a conference call with analysts where the analysts ask you questions and you answer them. This is the weird part of the finance world. It's been happening since the 2000s. However, the actual listening to the transcript and typing it up, we didn't do that in the firm. Within the firm, we had vendors, BPO firms in India that did the typing up of the transcripts. What we did on our side is that we went through and corrected it. Right? They were very good at typing up a transcript that was about 85% correct. But we on our end basically looked over it, listened to the audio, looked up terms, and got at that other 15%. Okay? So outsourcing part of the value production can be useful. All right? But there are some cautions. All right? The first thing is that you never want to outsource a core competency. For example, at one point, Yahoo's search activity, they outsourced some of it to Google. All right? That's just silly. Yahoo was a search company. That they would outsource some of their search capabilities to another search firm doesn't make sense because they are moving away from what was their core competency. Okay. The next bullet point should say, be careful around outsourcing something that creates value. All right. You have to be a little bit wary about it because things that create value can potentially help widen the wedge. Okay. So it has to be something for which you really don't think your firm can have any kind of advantage in doing it, right? Such that you can outsource that value creating activity to somewhere else. Okay. But the last one is key, and that's don't outsource an activity that creates capabilities. Okay. Or creates resources. For example, if you are some software companies in the past have actually outsourced their sales force. They have other people outside the boundary of the firm that are doing the selling of the product and managing the complaints or requests from consumers. Now, if you talk to people that work in software, one of the things that you'll find out is that the ideas for new product features often come from consumers, either things they suggest or complaints they have. So when you outsource that function, you lose the ability to directly get that key information from your consumers. Okay? You also miss out on the possibility of training employees to build good customer relationships, such that they can have even better interactions with your consumers, such that you get more ideas about how to make your product better. Right? And this comes down to sort of a big idea, is that value chain activities are the accumulation of organizational capabilities formed through performing specific tasks. Okay? All the stuff that's happening in the value chain is basically all of the organizational learning that's happened over time. Over time, Starbucks has figured out some of the most effective ways to get all of its raw materials all around the globe to all its various locations. Okay? That organizational capability, that knowledge is stored in the value chain. Okay? Activities in a value chain are the stock of organizational capabilities to perform specific tasks that result from this ongoing learning process. Now, when the activity is split across locations or it's not performed in the location within the organization, a feedback loop goes away. And this is what I meant by the arrow. Okay? So, you've got a value chain, right? Goods come in, stuff comes out. Some of that stuff, is obviously the stuff is sold. That's the idea. All right. The firm creates value and it makes profits. Okay. The money can come back to the firm and the firm can then reinvest it in stuff, or it can be distributed out to owners or shareholders. Okay. The other thing that happens is that firms learn lessons or they confirm their strategy by doing stuff. Right? You have a good year, you do stuff, it tells you that what you're doing works. Okay? And so you keep doing that, or something doesn't happen quite right. Well, you've learned a lesson. You then revise what you're doing in the firm. You change what you're doing. See if that's more successful, right? So you get these feedback loops that help you to reconfigure your capabilities and your activities, or to reaffirm them because they're working, okay? When you outsource part of those activities, you can lose some of that learning. Outsourcing can interrupt that feedback loop. That's what I mean by the arrow that I talked about at the very beginning, right? If you outsource too much, you lose on the opportunity to build up those capabilities. So that's the challenge with outsourcing. You have to balance it, right? Because if you outsource too much, you lose out on the opportunity to build new or better capabilities that will allow you to create more value. Right? So outsourcing is useful, but you can't do it too much. You miss out on things. Now, the value chain that you have in a firm will look different depending on your business level strategy. Okay? If you're a cost leadership company, those activities will be focused on driving down cost. And if you're a differentiation company, those activities will be focused on driving up willingness to pay. So look at this and you'll start to see what's happening, right? And there's two of these. I've got two of these diagrams, okay? One's differentiation, one's cost leadership. Now, if you're having trouble with the abstractness of this, okay, think that instead of thinking of it as a differentiated competitor, think of that one as Tesla, all right, and think of the cost leadership company as Walmart, all right? So your question is, looking at these diagrams, is which one is Walmart and which one is Tesla? And you can look at the things that they're doing, because that will tell you what they're trying to do. That will tell you what their general strategy is, okay? So let's look at this. Get my little pen here, okay? So we're looking at finance. All right. Technology and innovative products. Highly qualified employees invest in training. Positive relationships with major suppliers. High quality goods. Build strong relationships with customers. Specially trained after sales service. Okay? You can tell right now that this is not Walmart. This is not a cost leadership company. They are trying to get highly qualified employees. They invest in training. They care a lot about being innovative in technology. Good relationship with suppliers. High quality goods. Good relationships with customers. High customer care. This is a differentiated competitor, all right? Because all of these activities are the kinds of things that you do when you're trying to jack up willingness to pay. Okay? Compare it to this one. All right. Efficient hiring. Cost effective. Effective. Economies of scale. Low cost. Targeted advertising and low prices for high sales volumes. Efficient follow-up. Okay? This is a cost leadership company, right? They're focused on getting people in and being cost effective, having effective relationships. Not positive, effective. Focusing on economies of scale in order to bring down costs, using low-cost transportation, targeted advertising for high sales volumes, efficient follow-up. These are the things that would help a company like Walmart to keep its costs down. All right, and think of it like this. What if I told you that Walmart wants to take part of its stores and sell custom luxury men's suits. Would that work? Now, some of you are like, well, no, it wouldn't work. They simply don't target that kind of market. And that's true. Walmart is not targeting the kind of customer necessarily, or focusing on the kind of customer that would want a custom suit. No. But the other part of it is that they would not be organized to exploit any good process to make it. Okay? No part of their organization is configured to do that thing. Okay? You'd have to spend more on hiring, right? Walmart sales associates don't spend a lot of time with customers. Maybe to answer one question and that's it. You'd have to hire an entirely different kind of person to manage it, right? It wouldn't be a high sales volume kind of business. Custom suits, not a high sales volume business. It's a lower volume business, but a higher price point, right? Their whole marketing department would not be set up to do that kind of work. Okay, and that brings us to another point. Okay, I'm gonna go backwards a couple of slides to reemphasize this. Right, is that the more you do something, the more that these activities do something, the more that reaffirms the kinds of stuff that you do. All right, I think it was Plato that said, "We are what we repeatedly do." All right, firms are what they repeatedly do. And if your activities are organized around being a cost leadership company, you become even more of a cost leadership company over time because your success validates your model and you keep doing those sorts of activities. Okay? And that's why changing is hard. It can be hard to pivot from a strategy in an existing value chain because that value chain reaffirms your strategy over time. Right? Remember that learning arrow. That learning arrow reaffirms that strategy, And then remember Xerox, right? Xerox strategy was reaffirmed. It was reaffirmed that they are going to be in the business of selling copiers to large companies and that their whole value chain will do that. And the more that they made doing that, the more they were set up to do that. Now, there are exceptions. Some companies do pivot and they do it by expanding along the value chain. All right. An example that I think you would all appreciate is Netflix. Okay. Now, some of you are of an age to where you've only ever used Netflix to stream videos. That is not what Netflix first did. When Netflix first got started, they mailed DVDs to people. You'd go onto a website, you'd have a queue, like a list of all the movies that you'd want. They send you 3 at a time. You'd watch it. And, if you were done with it, you send it back to them in an envelope. And then they'd automatically send you the next DVD on your list. And we just keep going on like that. Now, one of the things that Netflix did when it first got started is that it tried to manage this part of its value chain, right? So you can see Netflix as being this box, right? They acquire DVDs, they get customers, and then they send out the DVDs to customers, right? Their main focus was acquiring content and getting more customers to sign up for their service. That's mostly what they did. They had to manage this part of actually getting the DVDs out to people. So what did they do such that this distribution interface would be smooth? Well, the main way that they sent out the DVDs was through the post office. Okay, so what did they do? They had very specifically measured envelopes that would allow the DVDs to be processed by the mail sorting machines at the post office more quickly, such that they could get out the door faster. That's how you make your product easier to get, right? This was the edge of their value chain. They needed to manage this, and they did that by making custom envelopes. Okay. Now, as we all know, Netflix has moved on and has actually moved both up and down the value chain. Okay. They are actually now in charge of their own distribution. You can still get DVDs, in case anyone's interested, but they are now in charge of actually getting the movie to you. Now, I know some of you are like, well, Prof D, doesn't your internet provider get it to you? Yes, that's true, but Netflix also pays other companies to essentially, give them server space such that their movies can be closer to where they're going to be watched, right? Such that there's no latency. Like they want to make sure that once you click a movie in Netflix, that movie shows up so you can watch it, right? So they are actually involved in the processes to make sure that the movie is distributed to you quickly. Okay. So they have moved this way. This would be forward vertical integration. They've also moved this way along the value chain, right? They create and buy unique content that you can't get anywhere else, right? And those things allow for an increase in customer willingness to pay, which in turn can allow Netflix to raise its prices, which it has done a couple of times. The unique thing about this is that if you can pull it off, vertical integration along the value chain can improve the end user experience precisely because one company has more control over that part of the value chain, right? Because remember what I said before. One of the ways that you can try to create an advantage is to manage the edges of the value chain, right? Netflix, when it first got started, did its best to manage this edge of its value chain. Okay, but if you can pull off bringing more parts of the value chain inside of your organization through vertical integration, you can actually have a better user experience, right? Think about Apple. In the case of Apple, moving up and down the value chain both allows it to realize better economies of scale, right? But it also allows them to better integrate technological development and product development, right? Because it's easier to figure out how to write software for the chips that you design, right? You have to know how the chip works before you can design an operating system for it. But if you're making the chips and the operating system at the same time, you can create a better experience. And you can have deeper control over the overall user experience, right? Apple has such complete and total control over its user experience in a way that other products simply don't. Now, there's probably technical, like complicated parts of it, okay? But how do you experience that as a consumer? Okay, which is that you go into an Apple store, you can buy 4 different Apple products, bring them home, plug them in, and they just work. Right? That's the benefit of Apple moving up and down its value chain. It can make such a good customer experience, and that's why people are willing to pay more for it, because it just works. And vertical integration along the value chain that improves that experience, that's why Apple did it. So, key takeaways from this. The value chain is how you are organized to add value. Your activities within an organization take inputs, they do things to them to create something for which the willingness to pay is higher than the costs. That's adding value. Okay, and you want to understand the linkages between those activities, because if you can make them closer, if all the activities in the firm work closely together, that can either bring down costs or bring up willingness to pay, and so it can be a source of competitive advantage. Depending on what kind of business level strategy you have, you will have different looking value chains, whether you're cost leadership or differentiated. And success reinforces activities on the value chain. As you sell stuff and get better at it, right, and have success, then that tells you that your strategy and the way your activities are organized is working, right? And you keep doing more of it, right? You get that feedback loop of learning. Those capabilities are how the activities in the value chain is how an organization stores knowledge about capabilities over time. And now, if you connect value chain, external analysis, and internal analysis, you can get a full picture of the competitive advantage that any one organization may have. This is actually pretty powerful stuff. Okay, so you're doing great. Now, the last thing that I want to say is that you all add value. Every single one of you has something that is unique that you can offer. Okay. Some of the things that you should think about in your own careers is where you can go and bring your unique configuration of capabilities and add the most value. It took me several years to figure this out. Right? But when I did, I realized that the place that I can add value is, doing this, is being in front of and teaching students. Now, one of the things I want you to do in your future work in this class and others is think about all of your own capabilities and or also capabilities and skills that you want to acquire, and then where you can go and take your unique portfolio of skills and capabilities and go add value. In the meantime, you should all know that you are adding value to this class. When you engage with the material and ask me questions and talk in Slack, you are increasing the value of this course to both current and future students. So just keep it up. I will always be around if you have questions. I look forward to talking to you in Slack, and everybody take care.